Good morning, everybody. Good morning in Germany and Europe, of course. Good afternoon in China and in Asia. Most welcome to our webinar today about the new strategy, China strategy of the German government. The title of the event is Germany's New China Strategy, What to Expect. Especially welcome to our distinguished guests and speakers today, Professor Mühlhahn from Zeppelin University, and Dr. Schaefer, the former ambassador of Germany in the People's Republic of China. I will introduce the speakers in a second. Let me first start with to explain a little bit the procedure. As always, we have the introductory statements by our speakers today, around 15 minutes or so. Then we have a moderated Q&A session, so you are most welcome to your questions, and we will stop after 60 minutes. Please note the introductory statements will be recorded. We will later post this also on our webpage, but we will not record the Q&A session. Having said that, let me introduce our speaker today. We will start with Professor Mühlhahn. He's the president and CEO of Zeppelin University in Friedrichshafen and one of the most well-known Scientologists here in Germany. He studied and received his PhD in Sinology in Scientology from the FU Berlin. He was also a visiting fellow at the Center of Chinese Study of the University of California in Berkeley. And in 2004, he was appointed as professor of contemporary Chinese and Asian history of the University of Turku in Finland. And he became professor of China's history and culture at FU Berlin in 2014, where he also acted as vice president. And just recently, he published a very fascinating historical book, Making China Modern from the Great Qing to Xi Jinping, which is actually in English available as well as in German. Our second speaker then is Dr. Schaefer. He was ambassador of Germany in the People's Republic of China from August 2007 to June 2013. Since 1978, he served in the Foreign Service of Germany, inter alia New York, Singapore, and Geneva. From 1990 to 2002, he was deputy. 1999 to 2002, he was deputy director for Southeastern Europe, and until 2007, political director of the Federal Foreign Office, in charge, among other issues, of the nuclear negotiations with Iran. After his diplomatic career, he acted as the chairman of the board of directors of the BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt, until the end of 2002. Dr. Schaefer received his PhD in international law from the Max Planck Institute at Heidelberg and the University of Mannheim. Having introduced the speakers now, before I hand over to the speakers, let me shortly say a little bit about the topic today. German strategy. This was published by the German government on July 13. And of course, all of you know there was an intensive debate already ongoing a half year before, because two China papers from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Economics have been leaked to the public. And all parties since then have also published their own strategy papers, including then also the Asian Pacific Committee of the German industry. Having said that, it's not really a surprise that the new strategy is focusing in economic terms on the so-called de-risking and in political terms on systemic rivalry, mostly justified with the international role of China, but also with the political system and human rights issues. Simultaneously, China is judged as a partner and competitor, and it is stressed that in economic and trade relations, China keeps an important partner, or should keep an important partner also in future for the German industry. The new strategy is basically justified with a changing China in recent year and stresses Western values more than in previous years, where business interests dominates very much. The paper covering all areas, including geopolitics, the economy, the civil society, climate actions, Europe, as well as academic cooperation. The paper has mainly two goals. One goal is to present the government's view, of course, on China, and secondly, outline the respective to-dos. After having read the paper, you will immediately realize that the first goal, to present a view, is much more precise than the second one, which keeps more or less ambiguous and somehow preliminary, which is probably also a question or a result of a political compromise in the parties who are in charge of the government. Yeah, so far I'm very much from my side, I'm very interested now to the statements of our speakers. Professor Mühlhahn just back from China, and he has also impressions from there. I read already in a newsletter that you also discuss with Chinese friends and colleagues some of the elements of the strategy. So I'm very much interested, Professor Mühlhahn, what is your opinion on the strategy, China strategy of the German government? So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for giving me the chance to speak here today. So I think as Germany navigates an increasingly complex global relationship with China, we must ask ourselves, and it's a right question, how should we proceed? The answer to this question, let me just briefly state, is crucial for the ensuring of well-being of citizens in Germany and German society, as well as the security of future generations. As I always say, there is no bigger question in our generation. We stand at a critical juncture in Sino-German relations with escalating confrontations and potential implications for the international system. And as we are at this critical juncture, I think it's necessary to strive for a clear-eyed, effective strategy that has or offers solutions. So hence, in principle, I think that it is right for the government to look for a solution-oriented approach. This is in principle commendable, but I also do think that the current strategy fails to provide convincing responses. And I have a couple of points here that I would like to make. First of all, I think any strategy should start with an honest analysis of strengths and weaknesses. That is, I think, missing. The parts that look back on the history of Sino-German relations are very general. This would have been, though, an opportunity to take stock. What has worked in the past in Sino-German relations? What did fail? What was achieved? What goals have been missed in the past? And above all, these very important question of dependencies or interdependencies. What exactly are these dependencies? How can be defined and measured, and how can we work with them? But since it's so general, these very specific points are largely missing, and hence I think a strategy that is not based on a clear analysis of successes and failures is very, very difficult to have a positive, to pursue a goal. Second, the China strategy asserts that China has changed, therefore requiring a new strategy from China, as Mr. Löchel has already said. China is called partner, competitor, rival, all at the same time. But the notion of rivalry, I think, clearly dominates. The wording in the document mainly portrays China as having become an aggressive, systemic rival, using its newly acquired power to intimidate other countries and extend regional spheres of influence. This is based on a certain reading of the Chinese situation, its intentions and strategies. My problem with this is that this does not take into account the nuances that we also find in China. China, I mean, it's already, I think, very clear that the document uses the word China almost without distinction, indiscriminatorily. So that means all the nuances that we see in China within the party, within the government, between the local level and the central level, between civil society and the party, between various social groups, all this is missing. China is simply portrayed as a very large monolithic, as a black box. And I think a strategy that fails to understand the enormous complexities of China today is also, again, it's unlikely for such a strategy to succeed. Third part, the strategy, as has always been said, maintains several times that China has changed, and China has changed, but so did others. So did other global actors and the global environment. International institutions from the WTO to the United States have also been eroded and weakened by Western governments, such as the United States. So the one-sided blaming of China for all the deterioration of the relationships in the world, I think is misleading. The strategy takes for granted that China uses its increasing power to change international order according to its visions, but it neglects that other countries as well have misgivings about the rule-based international order, such as India, Brazil, or even Turkey, who are also demanding reforms of the international order, which they perceive as dominated by Europe and the US. So I think the problem here is that, all the focus is on China, but we miss that there is a larger tendency in the world that is critical of the current state of the international order. And I think this makes the challenge actually much bigger. Third, that had already been also mentioned by Mr. Löchel briefly, the strategy is unclear in terms of its objectives. While attempting to define German values and interests, it seems to lack a clear focus. Even the section on German values and interests is extremely broad and vague. It mentions numerous priorities from liberal democratic order, European Union, protection of international order, promotion of growth, and so on and so forth. But it remains unclear how any progress or success in implementing these goals, values, and interests should be measured. What are actually the concrete benchmarks or goals that Germany wants to achieve here? My fourth point is there's a risk, and a big risk, and I can tell this just from the talks that I had in China last week. There's a risk that the China strategy is perceived in China, despite different language in the document, but it's mainly perceived in China as an attempt to contain China, which I think will lead to further problems. Many interlocutors in China have stressed that this is how they understand the use of the term rival. Some said, it's okay for competitors to cooperate. But do you really cooperate with a rival? What does rivalry mean? And where does rivalry end? What is our end goal of rivalry? And normally, rivalry only ends with defeat or victory. So this, I think, limits the chances for cooperation greatly. The paper does also avoid any discussion, for instance, of the CHIPS Act that the United States decided upon in late October. And in the words of the New York Times in an article from July, just a couple of weeks ago, this CHIPS Act, which basically limits Chinese possibilities to buy semiconductors or purchase semiconductors and high-end chips, so the very highly developed semiconductors, this strategy is described in the words of the New York Times as, I quote, essentially seek to eradicate, root and branch, China's entire ecosystem of advanced technology. And just a reminder, this also implies, of course, certain scientific research, for instance, in the fields of medicine, or it cripples China's capacity, for instance, to model or calculate climate change. All these are operations for which you need high-end semiconductors. So I think the CHIPS Act is, in a sense, very close to blocking and containing China's development. And the strategy does say nothing about how Germany positions itself vis-a-vis the CHIPS Act. So we should be very careful that we see that how all these measures are seen in China. And when I say in China, I mean my colleagues and people that have or want to maintain good and close relations, that hope for change in China, but they also feel threatened by this wording of rivalry. And then my last point is, the China strategy emphasizes that to ensure German competitiveness, a policy for promoting growth and innovation at home is necessary. And that is certainly true. However, it fails to provide concrete pointers how this very, very big goal, it's a goal that, several other generations or several other governments have already failed to accomplish, I think, to a certain degree. It fails to provide concrete pointers how this can be achieved. Moreover, as I think Dr. Schaefer will also comment on later, the opening sentences of the strategy make clear that no additional funds will be earmarked for that purpose. So this is obviously absurd that there is the idea of promoting growth and innovation at home, but not spending any money on it. So I conclude, overall, I think the German-China strategy could lead more to tensions than to cooperation, not only between Germany and China, but also between Germany and other global actors who hold different views regarding appropriate approaches toward China. I think Germany risks isolating itself in a global context from significant global dialogues and developments through a unilateral and under-considered China policy. Germany, which used to pride itself on its diplomacy and diplomatic traditions and its ability to build bridges, should adopt a more nuanced, reality-aligned, and forward-looking policy towards China. Undoubtedly, China remains a global force, even if it has enormous challenges, with which engagement is indispensable. A strategy that views this emergent titan mainly through a defensive and negative perspective as a rival is not only inadequate, it's risky. The real test for Germany, and indeed Europe, will lie in successfully managing relations with China while maintaining ties with the United States. This is particularly crucial in a time where relations between the two superpowers are very tense, but I think we find nothing in the China strategy on this enormous challenge. So a challenge, rather than an isolated and polarizing approach toward China, I think Germany needs a coherent global strategy, a strategy that reflects the realities and challenges of the 21st century and builds on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and cooperation. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Mühlhahn, for this very clear statement about strategy. I'm sure there will be questions and comments on that, but I hand over now to Dr. Schaefer to give his view on the China strategy of the German government. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Horst Löchel, and thank you for the invitation. Good morning to everyone in Germany and in other countries. Klaus Mühlhahn has identified, so to say, the macro criticism of a strategy which I will try to understand by looking into some of the concrete points which have been elaborated in that strategy. And I will come to similar, but in some points, differing conclusions. My first point is the strategy is a first step into the right direction. As Horst Löchel has said, it's a product of intensive negotiations within the red, green, yellow Ampel government, but it is a clear improvement compared to earlier drafts which were leaked to the press. I think in general, it strikes a relatively good balance in the difficult limbo between geopolitical and economic interests on one side and a value-based policy on the other side. As Klaus Mühlhahn has said, there was a broad agreement that a repositioning of our China policy was necessary in view of really dramatic changes in China, let me say, since 2013, since I left the country, changes which you, of course, are all aware and which I do not need to analyze in detail. But I would like to make just one remark. The balance between stability and reform and opening, which of course was the trademark of Chinese success story since Deng Xiaoping has been given up under Xi Jinping. Stability has gained absolute priority. The result we can see: stronger repression, more systematic human rights violations, less tolerance with civil society, intellectual artists. Xi's Chinese dream, the restoration of a powerful China without outside dominance, is the narrative for, I would say, a more nationalistic and ideological course. China first is today the predominant principle of Chinese policies in all areas. These deep and significant changes in China required, as Klaus Mühlhahn said, a sober assessment of our bilateral relations and a roadmap to readjust them. Now, here I agree, the strategy is striking the right balance, but it remains extremely short in providing concrete answers in some very relevant areas. My second point is the German strategy is a pillar of European China policy. It's very important to start defining German policy towards China as a part of a European challenge. Germany, not to mention smaller EU partners, is way too small to safeguard its interests alone in view of a rising big power conflict. Let's be clear, China has become a global giant, geopolitical, geo-economic actor, having influence on every relevant global issue. And from Washington's point of view, China is threatening US economic and geopolitical supremacy, not only in the Indo-Pacific. No matter if we call this a new Cold War or a looming big power conflict, Europe needs to put its act together to consolidate the still very diverging China policies of the EU 27. German strategy, I think, makes an important step in that direction. It has incorporated most key elements of a position paper by the EU Commission, such as the notion of de-risking, and articulates very clearly to formulate an autonomous European policy towards China. Now, autonomous European policy, of course, does not mean equidistance. We are, of course, in many ways closer to US values and interests, but it does not describe European interests as identical with those of Washington. It clearly indicates that the European Union is not ready to follow a grand American strategy of confrontation with Beijing. The declared goal is rather to decrease dependency from China, to prevent China from unilaterally changing the terms of reference of the international system. But it does not aim, and this is important, it does not aim at isolating China. It argues in favor of binding China into global processes, not only in the fight against climate change. The EU reference, therefore, I think is important, but again, it remains short of a clear vision by the German government to take leadership in consolidating an EU policy. My third point, clear advocacy for de-risking instead of decoupling. As I indicated, the German government has adopted von der Leyen's notion of de-risking, developed before her visit to Beijing in May. The strategy acknowledges the fact that our economies have become and will remain heavily dependent on each other. That is not seen as a problem per se, but one which becomes an issue in light of increasing asymmetries, be it in trade, in direct investment, and in particular in the provision of rare raw materials. It consequently aims at reducing unilateral dependencies, volatile supply chains, as we could have seen during the COVID crisis, and diversification of imports of raw materials wherever possible. De-risking in this sense is not limited to risks of individual companies. It is seen as particularly threatening in cases of so-called cluster risks, in German Klumpenrisiko, affecting sensitive infrastructure or key areas of domestic security. The strategy refers to de-risking numerous times, but unfortunately stays short of defining where it starts and what kind of action the government is ready to devise if China action fulfills such criteria. 4, and this has already been mentioned, the triad partner, competitor, systemic rival governs the bilateral relationship. Angela Baerbock, our foreign minister, in presenting the strategy a few days ago, underlined several times that the aspect of rivalry has become more and more prominent. Analyzing the strategy itself, this hierarchy, for me, is much less clear. It analyzes a multi-layered relationship with a complex country which remains an indispensable partner in many fields, which will be a more and more challenging economic competitor, and an increasingly tough systemic rival when it comes to making the system of global governance fit for the 21st century. Although it refers to numerous negative developments, in particular in the context of our divergent value systems, the strategy offers no answer if and where the rivalry really becomes a challenge or even a threat to our interests, and what the government is intending to do if it does. Now, in view of the available time, it would be good, would go too far for me to analyze all key areas relevant here, but I will pick a couple of them as examples. 5, China's cooperation remains indispensable in preserving the common good. The strategy leaves no doubt. Clear priority for the cooperation are all areas covering the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN Agenda 2030. We can't find effective solutions, of course, to climate change, fighting new pandemics, or reducing global poverty without China taking an active part. Therefore, new dialogue mechanisms like one on climate and transformation are going to be put on track, and others, and we have more than 50 of them, will be revitalized. This is the opposite of decoupling, although the increasing difficulties to revitalize civil society processes are expressly recognized. 6, cooperation with China in multilateral fora is a priority. One entire chapter is dedicated to China's increasing global outreach, resulting in partnerships pushing Chinese interests. And Klaus Mühlhahn rightly has referred to the fact that this, of course, is true to many global stakeholders and actors. Now, looking at the response, one response to this increasingly assertive China outreach is the decision to strengthen German and European partnerships around the globe. But in contrast to the transatlantic discourse beforehand, which concentrated on concepts like forging a new alliance between liberal democracies on one side versus autocracies, the strategy intelligently does not envisage the building of new blocs, forcing countries of the global south to choose between China or the West. None of them would accept that anyhow. The strategy rather opts for open competition and cooperation on the basis of a rules-based order. This is, in my opinion, a key element in the strategy. By the way, one which may become the kicking point in the next years to come. How can we successfully convince China to take an active role in shaping the global order together with other stakeholders, to make China part of a multilateral process rather than putting up competing regional or even global systems? To overcome this problem, the strategy offers, in my opinion, too few concrete ideas. 7, strengthening European economic sovereignty. Now, by adhering to the realistic assessment that economic interweaving of our economies cannot and should not be eliminated, the reduction of critical dependencies becomes priority. That requires adjustments in basically all areas of economic exchange, tackling unfair practices against European companies in China, market access, transfer of technology, fair regulations in cyberspace, all based on the principle of reciprocity, a principle which has been advocated by us since a decade, but never successfully implemented. The strategy now makes reciprocity a priority, however, without clearly explaining which action the government is ready to take in cases of severe violation of this principle. Again, European power will be necessary to enforce this very important element of economic cooperation. More clearly spelled out is the intention to enforce capabilities to strengthen European competitiveness and technological sovereignty in areas of innovation. One key area will be that of cyberspace. 8, Taiwan remains the white elephant in the room. Although the strategy touches this hottest issue several times, it adheres to well-known positions. The key message to Beijing is Germany adheres to its one China policy. It has been a continuum since the establishment of diplomatic relations since 1972, cornerstone of our bilateral relations. But one important addition remains a central part of that policy. And I cite, a change of the status quo in the Strait of Taiwan must only be brought about by peaceful means and by mutual agreement. End of citation. The strategy is very clear regarding the conditionality. However, it remains short of making a concrete statement of how Germany or the EU would react to a Chinese unification by force, as indicated as an option by Xi Jinping in recent statements. So no red lines have been drawn. Strategic ambiguity remains. My 9th point, dealing with China requires more competence and coordination. The strategy acknowledges these deficits. It envisages better coordination at federal, provincial, and communal levels. And it supports the build-up of independent China competency. However, these objectives, which will be extremely costly, are not at all backed up, as Klaus Mühlhahn said, by budgetary decisions. On the contrary, the implementation of the entire strategy is supposed to be cost neutral. If that would be the case, it could become a toothless instrument. My last remark, how to make friends without trying to. It may be the wrong question, as national strategy is supposed to identify the what and how of solving strategic challenges from outside. But a strategy declaring the other side partner, competitor, and rival at the same time should, in my opinion, ask how this mélange will be perceived by the addressee. And as Mühlhahn has rightly asked, why would I volunteer to be a partner if I'm regarded as a foe at the same time? The strategy remains short of showing new avenues to build trust. Trust which remains, in my opinion, the currency of international relations, even if I have to deal with an increasingly difficult actor like China. And I will conclude with this statement. Thank you.